so before the break we would start in the 1950s, and I said the video that we watched this morning, the key difference in that video was between the haves and the have-nots. And the haves we talked about were the people in the 1950s in the US that had access to rock and roll music, buying records, buying magazines, cars and jobs. These are the kids of Ericsson. So these are the kids that Ericsson was saying, these guys are having an identity crisis. Don't worry, they'll get over it. They're experimenting. They're trying to find their place. Okay? That's what he's trying to say. He's trying to answer what's happening around him. Every theorist is trying to answer what's happening around them. Like G. Stanley Hall was trying to answer what he saw happening around him. Like Mason Jury in the 1980s was trying to explain what he saw happening around him. Everyone is trying to respond to what's happening. The kids that Ericsson are talking about are predominantly white, middle class. In that video, you wouldn't have seen many Negro Americans buying records. You would have seen one or two, and that would have been particularly if they showed any pictures from Detroit, because Detroit was the black motor capital of the United States, and a lot of the southern states moved up to Detroit. Okay, but you would predominantly in the big urban centres in the United States, the kids that were going through identity crises were the whiteys. In New Zealand, you'll notice in the video for the 1950s, which I think is in a few weeks' time you'll look at, you'll see the establishment of some of New Zealand's first youth clubs. Youth clubs enable young kids to experiment with rock and roll, dancing and all that stuff in a safe adult environment where adults can control it. You'll notice that one of the very first youth clubs that started in New Zealand was in Nainai. And Nainai is a suburb in Wellington, which is now predominantly Māori. So predominantly in the 1950s and late 1940s in New Zealand, the predominant working class community in cities were white, and we had our Māori brothers and sisters moving into the city to work in more trade stuff. And then when those jobs got all used up, as we start to enter into the early 60s, there's a call over to our Pacifica brothers and sisters to come and join us to take up the jobs that no one else wants. Okay, but what we have to understand is Ericsson is responding to what he's seen amongst young white Americans. They are going through an identity crisis. Now I have to be honest, I've read his stuff. I also know that he talks about young Native American young people, but his predominant theory is on white middle class youth. Okay? Now in the States at the time, we saw, one, an absence of black faces, but two, in that video we saw young black men going away to fight and saying we're getting treated like citizens over there, but when we come back home we're second class people. Now what we have to realise is that their story is completely different. We'll put Detroit aside and those big industrial cities aside, and cities like LA and Chicago. And I'm putting Chicago down there purposely, okay? In cities like LA and Chicago, a lot of black families had moved to those cities for jobs, and we get this talked about in New Zealand, particularly in places like Auckland. When suburbs change from being white suburbs to brown suburbs, then the white people get scared and they run out and they leave. They take all of their social structures with them. I'm not saying that the Negroes didn't have any social structure, but they've come from another social structure into an area where they haven't been able to apply their own social structure. This is quite important for places like Chicago. So we've got a lot of white flight happening, a lot of Negro families in suburbs, and not many jobs. But this group of young people have money to spend. We have a group of young people over here who do not have money to spend in the USA. These are our Negro youth. Now, nothing has been written much about the Native Americans, so we can't even push them into according to the United States Constitution, they are a separate nation within a nation, and so a whole different set of laws and that apply to them. So, yeah, that's an awkward, that's tricky territory to start walking into the Native American story. So we'll stick with the predominant white and Negro story. Now the Negro youth in cities like Chicago, lots of them there, and all they've got access to is inequality. Okay? Now in Chicago, a really cool theorist with the greatest last name, a guy called Thrasher, decides he's going to go and live with gangs. He's going to actually live with gangs and see what it's like to be a gang member. This sort of research is called ethnography. Ethnography is when the researcher goes to live in the world of someone else to learn what it's like. So he did an ethnography of living in gangs. And he saw that the crime in a gang served a particular function. Okay? I know people don't want to talk, but I'm going to ask, what do you think crime in gangs, what function do you think it serves? What particular functions, I should actually say?
Finance.
Finance. It gives you access to resources.
Yes.
Very important. If you haven't got food, you've got to get it some other way. Okay? What else does it give you?
A structure of...
Structure.
Yeah.
So it gives you a social structure. These are very important functions. It gives you something else. Identity. It gives you a sense of identity, a sense of belonging. Okay, so crime in a youth gang serves a particular function. Okay? Now Thrasher was writing for a whole group of researchers, and they call themselves the Chicago School. That's why I said Chicago is important, because all their research came from Chicago. Okay? So Thrasher, he's writing about youth gangs, and he says it performs a particular function. That function is around resources, social structure, and identity and belonging. Okay. Now another guy within the Chicago School, and you'll get mixed up with these guys. I'm taking you down a different path now. You'll see that the story of the haves is told to you by psychology. The story of the have-nots is told to you by sociology. Okay? And in sociology, there's a lot of people with this last name. So another guy called Albert Cohen, who's also from the Chicago School, talked about gangs being a subculture. Okay? And what I'm going to do now is stop the camera because I've got an activity for subcultures.